So I'm Paola Giuliano. I am a professor of economics at the Anderson School of Management. So if you took 405, I usually teach managerial economics at the Anderson School, which is the core econ class, and I've been teaching it in different programs. Most of the time, the full-time MBA program, but also the FEMBA and 1 year the EMBA. So today I'm going to talk about the role of cultural norms in education. And it's mostly based on my research or research done by economists on the topic. And so let me start with a broad motivation. So most of my research focus on the role of cultural norms in affecting different type of economic behavior. And so the way we think about culture in economics is think about all those beliefs or preferences and any type of values that different groups, so this could be a religious group, an ethnic group, or a social group, tend to transmit from one generation to the other. So some parents tend to transmit to their kids that they need to be patient, or that effort is important to get ahead in life, and so on and so forth. And so one of the cultural norms that has been studied quite a bit in economics, but also in other social sciences, is long-term orientations, or also patience. And so essentially this is a preference to forego short-term gratifications for long-term rewards. So how much I'm able to sacrifice immediate satisfactions to some outcome in the future. So this is a map of the world that essentially classifies on a scale from 0 to 100 different countries based on the degree of patience. So Asian countries tend to have a level of patience which is very high. Usually Latin America and Africa, it's on the low side of the distributions. The US is not particularly high as well, and then Europe is somewhere in between. So these are some of the values, just to give you a broad overview of what economists have been thinking in terms of cultural norm. So these are some of the values that have been considered important for economic outcomes. So initially they were collected in the 70s, and then the collections continue over time by Hofstede. And so what he did was very interesting, meaning that he wanted to see if countries were different in terms of cultural norms. And he collected data on IBM managers in 70 different countries. And the idea is that he wanted to have a group that was very similar in terms of occupations, and he wanted to see if the characteristics the cultural values were very different. And so cultural values that economists have been studying quite a bit are individualism versus collectivism. So this is the importance in a society of an individual versus the group. Long-term orientation or patience, again, this is the ability to forego short-term gratifications for long-term rewards. Power distance is another important cultural norm. So this is the expectations that the power is distributed equally in society or not. So there is a website where you can see how different countries differ in terms of cultural value. So this is what I did. I put two countries that are often different in several dimensions. This is China versus the US. So for instance, if you take long-term orientation, people in the US are not very patient. So again, on a scale from 0 to 100, they score 26. And then China is one of the countries where the level of long-term orientation is fairly high, so it's 87. Another interesting value is individualism. The US is a very individualistic society, again, score of 91, and then China is very collectivistic, so it's 20. So these are big discrepancies. And so what economists have been doing, we have been asking big questions. So one is, if we take these differences in cultural values across the world in terms, again, of patience, does it matter for economic growth? And so this is not from my research, but is on a paper that studied these questions. And what you see here is, if you plot the growth in GDP for different countries, let's say from 1980 to 2010, and you see the relationship with long-term orientations, you see that countries that are very patient tend to have a higher level of economic growth. And so what I did in part of my research is asking the following question, which is, if you transmit a different degree of patience to your kids, so if you teach them to be patient, does it matter for educational outcomes? So does it matter on how well they do in school? So the idea is not new in the sense that probably you know about this experiment. So this is an experiment that was done in psychology in the 70s, and so it's called the marshmallow study. And so what they did is the following. They had several kids, and they put them in front of some marshmallows, and then they told the children, if you wait, you're going to get the double amount of your marshmallow. And then they observe what the kids did. And then they left the kids alone. And then some children, they were very impatient, so they just ate the marshmallow that they had in front of them. And then some children, they were very patient and they were rewarded. And so what they did, they follow these kids over time. And so they look at their level of wages, how well did they do in school, SAT score. And they did find, again, the sample was very small, that kids who were very patient, they tended to do well in terms of educational outcomes or economic outcomes. So they had higher wages, they had better score in school, and so on and so forth. And so what we do in one of our studies, so this is done with several co-authors, we want to see if transmitting different level of patience to your children matters for educational outcome. And we use a variety of data. So most of the data come from Florida. And then I will tell you why do we use Florida, and then we look at basically 37 different countries. So Florida is, for our purposes, is very interesting because we have all the administrative data for the public schools, so for more than 10 years. And what we want to do, we want to observe the performance of immigrants' children. Okay, and so we want to look at first-generation immigrants. So these were children who were born, let's say, in Italy or China or Latin America. And then we also want to look at second-generation children. So these are children who were born in the US but with parents born abroad. And the idea of looking at immigrants is a sort of, we call it natural experiment. So they were raised in different countries, or they were raised in the US, but their parents came from another country, so presumably they had different cultural values, okay? And so the other things that we can do with Florida is the following. Usually, so we have the school records, so we can follow children over time, so how they do in school. But we also have birth certificate. So normally in the school record is not indicated where you are coming from, but from the birth certificate we knew where the mother, if the mother was born in the US or if the mother was born abroad, and then in which country. And so this is what's the outcomes that we study in our paper. So, well, first of all, we have millions of observations. So we have the universe of all the public schools in Florida from 2002 to 2012. So one of the outcomes that we are interested in is a comprehensive assessment test. So these are standardized test score in mathematics and readings. Then we know whether the children graduate in time from high school. We know the retention. We know the degree to which they are absent from school, and then we know if they are involved in disciplinary incident. And so let me give you some chart. So here, this is what we did. So these are all the immigrants that I see in Florida from different countries. And so what you see here is how long-term oriented they are in the x-axis, and then in the y-axis, I standardize the test score, and they go, let's say, from 0 to 1. And what you see here is a remarkably strong correlation. So if I take children, again, in Florida, who who were born in South Korea, China, Singapore. Remember, these are the patient countries, or a lot of the Eastern European countries, so Russia, Ukraine, they tend to do very well in school. Instead, children coming from less patient countries, their performance is lower, okay? So these are raw correlations, but we can control for the level of education of the mother. We can also control for the zip code where they live, so we have a sense of their socioeconomic status, and so, but the correlation is essentially pretty strong. So these are many graphs, so let me guide you through that. So as I told you, we're looking at different outcomes. So one is the performance in mathematics. So this is, I just put the name of the country smaller here. So this is similar to the previous chart. So if you come from a country that is very long-term oriented, you tend to do well in math. So I can follow children over time. So I can look at their math score in grade 3, and then I can see their math score in grade 10. So I can also look at the improvement over time. And what we see is that even if you look at the improvement over time, if you come from a country that has a high degree of patience, then also the improvement in math is much higher. So we did this for mathematics, we did this for readings. Remember, a lot of these students, they probably have enrolled in limited English proficiency classes, but they still do quite well. So they're also more likely to graduate on time, and then they have less negative outcomes. So they tend to have lower level of absence in school. They are involved in fewer incidents, and then they are less likely to be retained. Okay, so it seems that patience is really, really important for educational outcome. Now, so this is another way of looking at the data. So what we wanted to do is we want to compare how immigrants do compared to their classmates who are people from the US. And so this is what this chart represents. So here I have the grade attended by the student, so from grade 3 to grade 8, and here I have the how they do in math, okay? So this is what this chart is telling me. So the green line, the yellow line, these are people from the US. Actually, no, the green line are people from the US. And for the US, we know that there is a large racial gap. So what I did, I have the overall people from the US, and then I just have US-born students who are white, okay? And so the blue line are just the first generations, okay? And then the red line is the second generation, okay? So again, first generations are people who are born in a different countries. Second generations are children who are born in the US, but whose parents come from a different countries. So what you see is quite interesting. So first, in grade 3, if you compare them at least to white students, their performance is similar. But then immigrants, especially first generations, they do much better over time. Okay, so their math score improve, and then people from the US are fairly flat. And then when you look at second generations, the second generations, they start to be much more similar to people from the US. Okay, so they probably have, they assimilate in terms of many cultural values, maybe including patience, but this is the trend that we see. So this is for mathematics, so this is reading. So again, this is everyone from the US, and then these are people, US-born white students. So when we look at immigrants, of course, in readings, they start at a disadvantage, so their linguistic proficiency is lower, but again, their performance increase, and then when they reach grade 8, they tend to do much better than US-born students, okay? So this is about the performance of immigrants. So then you may say, well, maybe people born in the US or immigrants, they tend to go to different school. And so what we did is the following. So remember, if you look at the level here, So this is an average of 0.2 for people from the US. When we look at the data from Florida, we know how good the school is. So let's say there are letter score for different schools. So we just selected schools that have an A score. So these are very good schools in the public school system. And so what you see is that if children go to a high quality school, their performance is higher. So it moves for all of them, let's say from 0.2 to 0.3. But again, even in the schools where the quality of education is higher, then immigrants tend to do better. And again, for mathematics, they start at the same level of US-born students. For readings, they start at a disadvantage, but then their performance increase over time. So then the question is, there are many reasons. So maybe immigrants, they wanted to make it in the US, they work harder. And so what we did is the following. We remember that I show you a map of different countries. So we classified the countries in 4 different groups. So the lowest quartiles in terms of patients, let's say these are some of the immigrants from Latin America, and then the highest quartile for students who have a very high degree of patience. And so this is what this chart is telling you. So the flat line, these are again US-born students. So these are people who are born in Florida with parents born in the US and then grandparents born in the US. These are the immigrants. Remember, the level of patience for students in the US is 26. So these are immigrants whose level of patience is lower than the US. Okay, so this is the less patient countries. So what you see is that they start at a disadvantage, so they also improve over time. So probably the improvement over time is something that is very typical to an immigrant. But then when I look at the most patient countries, so these are, let's say, students from Russia, students from China, so their performance is much higher. So essentially is increasing with the level of patience. So, basically it's almost monotonic. So if you come from an impatient culture, you don't do as well in school. If you come from a patient culture, then the performance in school is much higher. And so this is for first generations. So this is interesting because it tells you that over time students assimilate. So when I compare the first generations with second generation, so these kids, they're already born in the US, their parents still transmit whatever, let's say the Italian culture, since I am from Italy. And so, but then over time, the students, they become much more similar. So, these big differences that you see in educational score, which are probably related to differences in culture, they tend to disappear over time. So this is for mathematics, and again, this is for readings. So again, for readings, there is a big disadvantage given their linguistic proficiency. But again, over time, students coming from patient countries, they tend to do much better, especially in grade 8. And then if you look at the second generations, there is a convergence. So now you may say, well, maybe Florida is special because it attracts a specific type of immigrants. Do these results generalize to other countries? And so what we did is we look at a different data set. So this data set is called Program for International Student Assessment. So we have 4 waves. So we have data for 2003, 2006, 2009, and 2012. And then we have 37 different countries, okay? So what we can do, let's say I can take immigrants who go to Italy, France, and so on, and then I can classify them as first generation. So again, these are people born in a foreign countries, and second generations. And I can look if whatever I show you in my graph for the US, if it's true all over the world, okay? And this is essentially the case, so the correlations are remarkably strong. So if I take immigrants who go to different countries, I find still these very strong correlations between their degree of patience and then their performance in educational attainment. So this is the correlations between long-term orientation and math, So this is reading, this is science. As you can see at the top, you always see the Asian countries and then Eastern European countries. And then retentions and truancy, you have a negative correlation. Again, these are for students born in different countries. If we look at second generation, it's still remarkably persistent. So even if you are from Italy and you have a kid in the US, you still transmit the Italian values, and then these values somehow matters for how children do in school. So then, in our study, we do find that being patient is very good. And then we read a very interesting studies saying that, but is it true that patience is good no matter what? And then this is some research that we did find. So this is not from one of our papers. So it's a very interesting study done by Sine Xie. So what they do is the following. So first, they look at the difference in educational achievement between Asian American and people from the US, okay? So this is the gap. So again, this is the difference between the performance of Asian students and then the performance of people born in the US. And then on the x-axis, you have grade from kindergarten to 12. And what you see is that very similar to what I found in my graph, there is an Asian American advantage if you look at test score. Okay, so kindergarten, the kids are very similar, and then Asian Americans, they tend to do much better, especially they reach a peak around grade 10. Okay, so what the author did was very interesting. They say, well, the Asian American students, they are probably taught by their parents to work really hard and to be patient, but are they happy? Okay, or are they satisfied with their life? And so this is what they found, is that actually in terms of life satisfactions, they were not doing very well. So they ask a series of questions. And so when they ask questions, are you feeling good about yourself? You find the opposite. So they were fairly unhappy. And so are you satisfied with the time that you spend with your friends? Again, negative, meaning that they were very dissatisfied compared to students from the US. Do you feel close to your mom, or do you feel close to your dad? And again, they were fairly dissatisfied. And so what we decided to do is we tried to if being patient is good. I don't know how to classify myself. I'm probably somewhere in between. So this is an article that I wrote for the Washington Post, and the title was Go Ahead and Eat the Marshmallow. And this is joined with a co-author of mine, so she's a professor at Northwestern at Kellogg. And so we were inspired by the paper about the Asian American students, and we want to see if it was valid, right? So we had all this data about patients all over the world, and then we also have various indications of happiness. And so what we find is that it's good to teach your children to be patient. They will do well in school, but don't overdo it. So, okay? So we found that there is an optimal amount of patience. And so this is how we did it. So I will show you the graph, but essentially we have data on patients for 70 countries. And again, the patients can go, it's classified in a different way, but can go from minus 1.31 to 2.076. So for these specific studies, we have about 17,000 individuals. So it's a very large number of subjects, and they're coming from 70 different countries, okay? And what we found is the following. So it's good to be patient, but then after a certain point, then it makes you really unhappy, okay? So the greatest satisfactions for this paper was the following message that I received. So the message is from a journalist that is the food journalist at the Washington Post. And remember I told you about the marshmallow test. So she was one of the subjects in the 1970s. And so this is what she wrote me. So I wrote the article for the Washington Post, and then 1 hour later, I received this message saying, I was a marshmallow kid at Stanford in Michelle's study. So Michelle is the author of the marshmallow test. I didn't delay gratification. So she's a very accomplished journalist, by the way. But I wanted my marshmallow pronto. So Michelle people followed me periodically until I was maybe 30. So they asked questions about job satisfaction, marriage, SAT score. And then throughout it all, I maintain that being patient is overrated, okay? That specific journalists say I'm the kind of gal who will wear new clothing purchased out of the store, but I think I'm happier than a lot of people I know who are more patient. And so thank you for vindicating my position. So this is, the external validity for my studies. And so this is what we did. So if we take the data for these 70,000 subjects in these 70 countries, so this is the distribution that you see. So there is a large variations. If I do it in a map, I found a map that is very similar to the one that I show you. So very patients are people coming from Asian countries. And so what we have in this specific data set are different measures of happiness, okay? So one question asks you, are you happy with your life today? The other questions ask, how do you think your life will look in 5 years? They can ask you, I think I will be very happy, I will be moderately happy, or very unhappy. And then there is a life evaluation index that combines both of them. And what we find is that if you have a level of patience and then a level of happiness, there is always an optimal amount of patience, okay? So in my study, in our data, patient goes from -131 to 2.76. The optimal amount of patience is around 1.76 or 2, depending on the scale, okay? Then we had different measures. So in this specific survey, there is also something called positive experience index. So this is about your experience in a daily life. So they ask you questions, did you feel happy today? Or did you smile or laugh today? And how much enjoyment did you have in your life? And then they combine all these positive experiences. And we systematically find that, it's good to teach your kids, assuming that you believe in cultural transmissions, that patience is good. But then after a certain point, the level of well-being essentially start to go down. Okay. So what we did in our research, we essentially, in the initial study that I show you, we find that if we take the case of Florida, being patient is good for educational performance. And so, the US is a country of immigrants. And so in another study, we asked the following questions. If you are a person who is born in the US, whose parents are born in the US, is it good for you to be exposed to people from different cultures? So is it good to have in your classroom immigrant students, okay? And so and this is what we did. So this is the map of Florida, okay? And so what this map shows are different school districts. And then a darker color indicates how many foreign students there are in school, okay? So for instance, if you take Miami-Dade, then the fractions of students is very high. And then in other parts of Florida, the fractions of students is much smaller. So this is the average. So if I take the data for Florida, so remember I have data from 2002 to 2011, in average, US students see roughly 7% of foreign students, okay? Then we start to look at the data by different ethnicities of race. And so what you see in the data is that there is a lot of sorting, okay? So what does it mean? It means that if I look at students who are in school predominantly white, they see only 7% of immigrants, so the exposure is much lower. If I look at school where most students are black, then the fraction of immigrants is 8%. And then in Florida, most of the immigrants come from Latin America. If I look at schools where the majority of students classify themselves as Hispanic, the fraction of immigrants is much higher, so it's 14. And then if you want to have a sense of the distribution, in some school, they can see up to 40% of immigrants, but in general in Florida, the fraction of immigrants in a school is pretty high. So then we wanted to see who goes in which school. And so, for instance, if I look at the overall school system, again, this is for Florida, 60% of immigrants come from Cuba, 10% from Mexico, Haiti, Colombia. We classify Puerto Rico as immigrants just because we don't have birth certificate, and so, but you can, you can consider them from the US, so you can scratch the 6%. So most of them are from Latin American countries. But then what we did is we split the school by white, Hispanic, and black. And what you see is that there is a lot of sorting. So people sort with students who are similar to them. So for example, in school where the majority of students are white, 13% come from Mexico, but then you start to see countries like Germany, Venezuela, and so on. In schools where the majority of students are Hispanic, 40% comes from Cuba, 9% from Colombia. And then in students where the majority of students are black, then 41% come from Haiti, 13% from Jamaica, and so on and so forth. So in economics, there is a big debate, at least in the educational literature, on whether having immigrant students in your school is good for the performance of people in the US or not, okay? And so in the literature, at least in economics, economists find a negative effect, either a negative effect or a zero effect. So what does it mean? It means that if other economists who have been looking at the data, they find that if I am a student from the US and then in my classroom there are a lot of immigrant students, then they reduce my educational performance, okay? So now the issue when you just look at the data is the following. First of all, what you see in the data is that is a phenomenon which is called native flight, meaning that there are, or which is very similar to the white flight in the US, meaning that when immigrants arrive, there are many families, especially white families, who tend to leave the school district. So they go somewhere else, maybe because they have a negative stereotype about immigrants, because they believe that having immigrants maybe reduce their performance of educations of your children. And so if you look at the data, in economics we say that they are biased, right? Because people go in different schools and there are many confounding effects. So what we do, we have data about siblings in our data set, so we have millions of observations. And so what we can do with our data, we can take two siblings, okay? And then I compare the performance of these two siblings who go in the same school, but they see different fractions of immigrants. So let's say the two of us are sisters. She sees 20% of immigrants. I see 10% of immigrants. We come from the same family, so we have the same socioeconomic background. If she sees a larger fraction of immigrants, does she do better than me in school? Okay? And so we found a surprising result, and the result is the following. So this is what the literature has found. So if you take the literature, basically, if you look at the performance of students in the US, and you look at the relationship with the immigrants, they found that if you have immigrants in your school, then the performance of children is negative, meaning that, if I am a person from the US and I have immigrants in my school, then immigrants essentially reduce my educational performance. And then when they split it by either socioeconomic status or race, they find that immigrants, they tend to have a negative effect, especially on white, but positive effect on black. And they tend to have a negative effect of not free lunch students, but a positive effect on free lunch students. So what we did in our study, which was just published, we say, well, But this way of looking at the data is not the correct one, because, you know, people sort in different schools based on their preferences. And then it might well be that when immigrants arrive, affluent families just leave. So the correct way of looking at the data is just to compare siblings. So I want to take people as similar as possible, and I just want to see at the variations of the fraction of immigrants. Once we make that adjustment, and so this is why, you know, the paper was new, we found that the results are very different. So we do find that if I compare two siblings, one which sees a higher fraction of immigrants versus the other, then the effect of immigrants on the performance of people in the US is positive, okay? And so it's not true that, you know, this is at least for the case of Florida. I don't know if I can generalize to different countries, but we do find that the effect is positive, and again, is especially positive for students with a lower socioeconomic background. So then the questions that we ask is the following. So why having immigrants has a differential effect, let's say, for low socioeconomic status or high socioeconomic status students? Sorry, these are many numbers. This is the last chart with a lot of numbers. So what we want to see if there is a story of relative standing, okay? And so what you see here is the following. Just look at this number. So if I look at the overall sample, so the mean of mathematics for all people US-born students is 0.05. So immigrant students, in average, they tend to do worse than people from the US. But then when I start to split them by group, I see big differences, okay? So for instance, US-born white students, they have a much higher performance. They see immigrants who are worse than them, but these immigrants, they do much better than the others. Then if I look at black students or free lunch students, their performance is negative. They see immigrants who don't do as well in school, but there is a story of relative standing, okay? So one possibility is that, well, I see immigrants, and then if I am white, the immigrants that I see, they do a little bit worse than me if I am American. But then if I am a black student, the immigrants who come with me in school, they have a slightly higher performance, so there is a sort of peer effect. So, you know, I'm paired with people who are a little bit better than me, and then this is why the performance increase. So this is one potential story, but then the other story is the following. We know that these immigrants then can be classified based on their degree of patience. And so this is what we find. We do the following, okay? So this is the performance of immigrants who have a degree of patience above than students from the US. And then this is the performance of students who have a degree of patience below the US. And so what I found what this chart essentially means is that if you are students from the US and then in your classroom there are very patient immigrants, then you do very well, okay? And then if in your classroom there are immigrants who are less patient, then you still do well. So having immigrants is good, but the performance is a little bit lower, okay? And we do this for different groups. So if you take students who are eligible for free lunch, so this is our measure of socioeconomic status. If you have, let's say, patient students, then they have a very positive impact on the performance of students from the US. If you have students who are less patient, still a positive effect. And then you do the same, if you do the same with no free lunch students, so these are the affluent students essentially in our sample. Again, if you see patient students, then patient students improve your performance, and then less patient students reduce it but quite a bit, not that much. And then if you split the sample by white and black, we find a similar effect. Again, this is, we just published this paper. I think the conclusion was different because compared to the different studies in economics, we find that overall having immigrants in your school, maybe because I'm an immigrant, I was happy about the result. If you have immigrants in your school, usually it improves the performance of students in the US, and more so if you come from a low socioeconomic background. So in the last 5 minutes, I want to talk about another type of cultural norms, which is gender attitude, and then I want to relate it to something that is very well known, which is the gender gap in mathematics. Okay, so let me give you some data about gender roles. So I don't know if you're familiar with the literature or with the data, but if you look all over the world, there are big differences in the degree on which women participate in the market. Okay, so for instance, if you take countries like the US, 70% of women work. In Iceland, 83% of women work. You may think it's just related to the level of development, but then if you take countries like Tanzania in Africa, 90% of women work. In Burundi, 93% of women work. On the other side of the distribution, take a country like Egypt, only 25% of women work, so the disparities are huge. And then, but even a country like my own countries, I left for that reasons, only 46% of women work. And then in Japan, only 6% of women work. When you ask women or men in different countries, what do you think about the role of women in society? Usually there is a very strong correlation between the role of women and then the gender attitude. Okay, so this is a classic question that is studied. That is asked, so when jobs are scarce, do you believe that men should have more right to a job than women? So if you take a country like Iceland, only 3% of the populations believe that this is the case, so they are very gender equal. If you take a countries like the US, again, only 10%. Rwanda is 28%, very low, but then if you go to Egypt, remember in Egypt, only 20% of women work. Almost everybody believes that men have more right to a job than women, and then similarly in Pakistan or even in Japan. And so this is how the world look like. So red countries are countries that are very gender equal, and then green countries are countries where they are very gender unequal. And again, you can compare. You can look at the extreme. It's interesting because countries with high female labor of participations, a lot of them are in Africa, and then these are countries with low female labor force participation. So economists ask, again, for the educational literature, because today I focus on educations, if you come from a country which is more or less biased in terms of gender norm, does it have an effect on the gender gap in mathematics? Okay, and so this is not one of my papers. So it's a paper by 3 other Italians, Guiso, Sapienza, and Zingales. It's published in Science, and what they found is a very interesting correlation. Okay, so this is what chart represents. So on the top you have the gender gap in mathematics. So this is the yellow line. And then this is the gender gap in reading. So women, they do very well in reading, but they don't do as well in math, especially in those countries. And then when you compare the performance in mathematics with an index that tells you how gender equal the country is, you find that the correlation is very high. So if you come from a country that is very gender equal, let's say Iceland, then you do very well in mathematics. So if you take girls in Iceland, remember, only 3% are biased in terms of gender norms. Girls do better in math. There is a lot of research on whether the reasons why women don't do well in math is because of predisposition and so on, but they essentially claim that, it's about gender norms. And so what we do, and I will be quick on this, we do the following. We have the data from Florida, and so what we want to do, we want to find families that have a preference for girls, okay? And so the way we identify this family is the following. So it has been shown for the US that even in the US, families, they still have a slight preferences for boys, okay? And the way it has been calculated by economists is the following. They look at the fertilities of families whose firstborn is a girl, and they see that if your firstborn is a girl, you keep on having children until the boy is born, Okay? And so essentially this has been done for the US. It's not as high as in other countries, but essentially using our Florida data set, we have the fertilities, so we know how the compositions of the siblings, and so we can classify the families as boy bias or girl bias, okay? And so we want to see, well, if the fact that you come from a family that has a preference for boys has implications for the way in which kids do in mathematics, okay? And this is my last chart. This is what we found. If you are in the US and you come from a family that is boy biased, so meaning that has a preference for boys, then the performance in mathematics of girls is lower, okay? And again, this is an interesting result, so it means that if I look at millions of observations and then I classify families with a more or less gender bias, I found that if you are gender biased, your girl will do worse in mathematics. And then what we do find is an interesting fact, which is these gender norms are only important for more affluent families. So if I split the sample by free lunch and non-free lunch, and then white families and black families, being gender biased only matters for essentially more affluent families. So it doesn't matter if you are poor socioeconomic background. So your gender norm do not have an impact on the performance in mathematics, but we do conclude that the gender math is essentially a white affluent phenomenon. So let me conclude. So again, it's a broad overview of the research that I've been doing on cultural norms and educational choices. We find that cultural norms matter for educational achievement. Patience is important, but don't overdo it. So teach your children to be patient, but not that much. And then consistently with what is found in literature, we do find that even in our data set, if you come from a family that has a more traditional or a more gender biased norm, this has an implications for gender differences, the gender gap in math. And with this, I am done, so there is some time for questions. Yes.
So you're looking at.
I'm sorry, we had a question.
Oh, here, yeah.
I have the mic. I've wanted to ask this question since you started. Based on your research, I've been trying to restrain myself. So
yeah.
I'm an impatient person. Thank you. So I know it's hard to boil all this down, but let me try to. I have a few questions. Let me just put them all out there, and hopefully you can elucidate. So. Patient score.
Yes.
That came from the research with the H.
Yes. Yeah. For Hofstede. Yeah.
Okay. And if let's give that. Let's say that's a given that's true. Are you in your research suggesting some kind of causal relationship directly in educational outcomes based on the patient score, and then as a corollary to that, how did you pull apart all of the other interchange, all the other variables in there, for example, income or wealth from the immigrants that came from these various places? Because and again, I'm just coming into this from what you said, so forgive me, but it seems like you're not suggesting this, but that someone could pick up that research and it would promote the kind of minority model minority myth, right? So can you help me on that?
That's an excellent question. So and the typical questions that I have in seminars. So the correlation causation is fundamental here, because what I'm claiming, and I will tell you why we try to claim causation, is a causation story, meaning that if your parents transmit you this type of beliefs, then you do well in school. So the questions that was asked about correlations, causation, so let me explain it better, is the following. It could go the other way around, right? So it might be that since I am richer or more affluent, I can afford to be more patient. And so the reasons why I see these correlations, in reality, the relationship goes the other way around. And then, we look at patients, but then, this immigrants group can have other characteristics. One is a socioeconomic status, maybe in their countries, the institutions do not work so well and so on and so forth. So I just present the summary result, but in the paper we take care. So we say we control for all of these characteristics. So remember, for Florida, we have millions of observations, so I can control for the educations of the mother, the zip code where they live, and so on. The other way in which economists have been trying to disentangle the causation correlation is the immigrants, especially the second generation, in the following sense. If I compare the educational score in China or Italy and the US, then your story is valid, right? So maybe students in China, they do better because the institution is better, or maybe the authoritarian countries, they do better in school, a variety of reasons. When we look especially at second generation immigrants, of course, the immigrants who come to the US, they can be selected. And so this is why we look at different countries. But the idea is that I take the children of people from different countries who are born in the US. So presumably they face the same educational environment. And so if I control for the socioeconomic status of the parents and so on, if I observe differences in educational performance by group, I can conservatively attribute them to culture, okay? I don't want to claim that there is, what I see also is that unfortunately, we cannot follow children more than the second generations. What I see is that these differences fades over time. So, over time, people assimilate, and so the environment, the peers, the teacher that you see matters. But yeah, we try, this is not a natural experiment. So the natural experiment will be I randomize people all over the world, and then, I see how they behave. So it's not a controlled trial, but we try to disentangle the causation this way. But this is an excellent question. I get it all the time. I think there is another question here and then over there. Yeah.
I'll come back.
Hi, Brian Johnson, class of 93. Would you say from your research, is your hypothesis that the parents who come from another country are imprinting their children with their values about patience?
Yes.
Or would you say that the parents have imprinted the values of their culture and therefore they have a different belief of the importance of education that then governs their children?
It's hard given the data. It's a very good question. Given the data, it's hard for me to disentangle. So because I can attribute, I don't have the individual level of patience. So what I have is, at least for the Florida experiment, so what I have is the average degree of patience than people have in China or in Italy. So I consider them as a part of, differences in cultural norms. It might well be that they have a different values of education. So what we do in our study, we also have measure of how good the quality of education is in the country of origin as a proxy for that. And we find that patience seems to be the relevant difference. So I would say that I believe that they transmit different values about patients. Yeah. So, yeah.
How much are the results in the study, especially when it pertains to African American students, biased by the fact that the study is done in Florida?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I think it's I cannot say for the differences between white and black students how generalizable it is. And so the only reasons why we were asked when we published the paper, the people wanted to see the difference between different racial group in performance, but I cannot say how generalizable it is to other cases, because for the other data set, when it's for other countries,
If you start in a state that's got notorious biases in the way that they educate groups, and that's the basis for the study.
Yeah. But I'm not claiming. So what I see actually is that usually if you look at the performance of immigrants, they tend to have a positive effect independently of the racial group. Okay, and then if there is a bias, what you're saying is that if I take a state in the US who is biased, and then even the result of the test score are biased to start with, I don't have a way of controlling for it. The only thing that I can do, but it was extremely hard to have, I asked school data to other states, even California, but it's extremely hard. So these are administrative data, so there is no way for me, to see how generalizable they are. Yeah.
Just from anecdotal experience, when you've got African American students that are in an environment that has a high percentage of immigrants,
yes,
some of the biases that they would naturally have occur tend to start to melt away, and it accounts for a difference in performance just in general.
Yeah. No. I agree on that. Yeah. So these were just averages. Yeah.
I'm just curious for multicultural families who
Yes.
may have differences in orientation, in addition to multi-generational, maybe that's the right term, where, one parent is a first generation versus second generation. Would your hypothesis be that the results in terms of academic performance might be closer to the second generation, kind of like a melting pot of experience?
So this is so for these studies, but also other studies, what we typically see is that over time, there is more assimilation. So these differences in culture are very pronounced for the first generation, and then they fade over time. So people assimilate, so they become less relevant. So this is true for educational performance. It has been studied also for difference in female labor force participation. So if you look at, let's say, female labor force participation of immigrants from Turkey, the first generation is much more similar to the behavior of women in Turkey. The second generation becomes more assimilated to the US. Unfortunately, we cannot follow people more than the second generation because the census asks up to the country of origin of the parents. Sorry, I don't know why the mic is higher. Yeah.
It's off.
Oh, it's off. Okay. Maybe I can talk with
Maybe
you.
battery. Yeah, maybe battery.
So let's me. I'll try like this. So it fades over time. Yeah, and yeah.
It works.
Okay.
One more.
Yeah.
So the kids in your cohort started in third grade.
Yeah.
Followed to 12th grade, right?
Yes.
All of the third graders, was it studied at what point they immigrated?
We don't know the type. We
So
don't know
some
the type
point before 8.
Yeah, sometimes exactly. Yeah. So we don't know. That's a good question because it could be that they just arrived, or it could be that they were born in the other countries, and so it would be nice to have that, but we don't have it.
I guess I'm still trying to get my arms wrapped around using Florida as a base study. Al Perry, class of '83, so I'm an old black man, okay? So I'm having a real hard time. I'm having a real hard time grasping why Florida as a base state would be used given Florida.
Yeah.
Okay, kind of enough said, I guess.
So what we do in the
But I have another question too. When you look at the country of origins where the immigrants are coming from, when you look at China and Japan, you're talking relatively stable economies, societies, not a lot of turmoil.
Yeah.
When you look at some of the South American and African nations where the immigrants are coming from, you don't have the stability. You don't have the economic levels that you have in China and Japan. So I'm wondering, how does that impact the results in terms of you're coming from countries where you can be patient.
Yeah, I know.
You know you're going to eat the next day. You know you're going to have these things.
Yeah.
Versus countries where you have uproar going on in turmoil. And, and you're not going to, long-term patience is not going to be necessary, a good thing in those countries.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how do you balance all of this out? And then, of course, you fly back to Florida. So how do you balance all that out?
Okay, let me start with the second and then I move to Florida. Okay. So with the second, that's a very good question in the sense that what you're asking is, well, these countries, they have reasons to be more or less patient. And so if I grew up in Argentina where there is a lot of, financial crisis, then of course I need to be impatient because my life changes every day. And so being patient, it doesn't, doesn't make any sense. So in some sense, the patience that I develop is a reaction to the economic conditions where I grew up. So in our studies, as I show you the correlation with patients, what we say technically is we control for these other characteristics. So even when I take into account the degree of instability, then I still find that there is residual differences in terms of patients that cannot be explained by the differences in economic instabilities. So there is a separate research, which is not my research, that studies where these differences in patients come from. And so they trace it back to pre-industrial societies and the type of instability that people had in the past. And so, your question, so we developed this degree of patience, probably was optimal. And so, but the question is, I don't want to say that being patient is good or bad. I just observe it. And then what I see is that over time, you converge to the optimal level of patience of the countries where you move. So for Florida, ideally, I wanted to have this data for all over the world, all over the US. The only state all over the US that was willing to give me administrative data that I could link with the birth certificate. So remember, for me, it's very relevant when I look at the effect of immigrants is to have siblings. And so I needed the school record to be merged with the birth certificate so that I can follow families. I tried to have data, the same data for California. California was not willing to share it, and then they were not willing to do it. And so the reasons why I didn't have time to do all, in the paper we have a lot of, we emphasize how Florida can be different in a variety of dimensions compared to other states, let alone the compositions of the immigrants, right? So the immigrants who go to Florida are different than the immigrants who go to California. And again, these are, the data are good for us in order to do an empirical analysis. And so what we try to do is these correlations between patients and educational performance, can it be generalized? I cannot generalize it to other states in the US simply because they never gave me the data. I wish they did. But I could generalize it to other countries. So by no means I believe that this is an optimal, environment. And I know that Florida is peculiar for a variety of dimensions. We are clear on, what are the characteristics of Florida that could bias the result on one way or the other. But this is why we look at the external validity, again, in 37 different countries.